Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with another episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today we have the illustrious Tyler Roberts on the show today. Tyler, how's it going?
Going great, man. Going great.
Awesome. So we are talking about passwords. This is the painfully persistent problem, and that is weak passwords. I was asking ChatGPT for like potential title ideas, and I'm like bouncing around all these things, and I'm like, what about painfully persistent or persistent problem? I was like going through all these like different names. So this is the one I landed on. So I hope you like it. So in this episode, we're diving into weak passwords and passwords in general and password defenses. And I know, Tyler, you this is kind of really top of mind for you because of some previous engagements with some law firms where we did some stuff with the passwords and user accounts, and I'll leave the exciting parts to you. But we're going to talk about passwords. We're going to talk about kind of understanding the problem. What is the problem with passwords and that kind of thing. We're going to talk about the pitfalls and kind of what to avoid from a defender standpoint, and hopefully provide some defensive mitigations and defensive advice for passwords in general. This is a very popular time of the year for phishing, for scams. So it's very important to be aware. And going into 2025, this is going to be a key thing as well to really wrangle and get a hold of. So Tyler, lay this out for us. What's kind of the problem? What stemmed this idea for this episode?
Yeah, I think before we get into the problem, it's important to understand who has the biggest area of concern for weak passwords. And I'd say there's a few vectors that are particularly more sensitive than others, that being your larger organizations, such as universities, I would say would be probably one of the most common, and then law firms as well, being another commonality there. Universities, because of their mass amounts of students and different avenues for password attacks, that's a huge avenue. And then law firms are particularly tricky because lawyers can be hard to get to change certain things. Even people like shareholders can be difficult to change in those areas as well, making it a little bit more difficult to get solid passwords in play. So those are probably the two biggest vectors that I see. With that, I've had two engagements in the past 4 weeks, where I've been able to pop not one, not two, but multiple, 3+ passwords on those engagements. And that's pretty concerning for me anytime I see that, because the list that I'm using to spray passwords for those user accounts is a list full of weak passwords or commonly used passwords. So I curate
Give
a
us
list.
An example.
So the biggest one is month, year, exclamation point, or just month, year would be a common permutation that we see a lot. A lot of the times we can do organization name, year, exclamation point. That's also a very common one that we see. So I put a bunch of these passwords in a list. There's usually about 50 to 60 so that can run the full length of the engagement. And then I just periodically check back on it. And with the engagement that I did a few weeks ago, I actually cracked 3 different permutations of October 2024, exclamation point. So, I'm looking for different permutations of all these passwords because, as I can tell in my proof of concept, I can pop multiple of these just by having them in the list. So a very common problem there. But the good thing is when I pop those passwords, I not only looked at their on-prem systems, the things that they owned, I also went out and looked at third-party services they were using that I scraped from DNS records. And everything was either SSO'd back to Microsoft 365, which had number matching MFA, which is super, super important, or it had its own form of MFA on that application. So, compensating controls there are super, super important because passwords are only your first layer of defense. And that's really important to remember. So even if an attacker like me gets a password for an account, if you have compensating controls, if you have conditional access policies, most importantly, if you have MFA, then I'm kind of going to be stopped in my tracks before I can even get going with those passwords.
Yeah, I mean, you really just summed up the entire episode in that last 3 minutes, so we can just be done. That's it. That's the gist of it. So for anybody listening, you don't have to listen anymore.
Thank you guys. It was great seeing everyone.
But that's great, and I think that illustrates this problem quite nicely and eloquently, and simply, right? So, from what I see too, is you look at an average person, right? And when you look at just the accounts we have for our companies or our organizations, we might have 5, 10, 15 different accounts, maybe more, that have passwords for them, right? So the part of the problem is we have a lot of passwords. The other part is we have passwords that change often or are required to be changed often, right? So that feeds into, having to remember these passwords and change them more often. And then, you're busy and you're working and you forget it. So that's part of the problem as well. The other kind of thing I wanted to set the stage with for this conversation goes back to the Verizon DBIR. So the 2023 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report said that 3 out of 5 breaches involved the human element. So social engineering, phishing, something related to a person, right? And then another article back in 2020, interestingly, by 1Password, which is a password management company, they did a survey of a whole bunch of IT professionals and a whole bunch of people, and they said 63% of people in organizations have created at least one account without their IT department knowing, or without them kind of having oversight on that account. And 2.6 of those said that they use a unique password. So there's a shadow IT problem as well. And that's what you alluded to with the single sign-on and that aspect of it. When a user signs up for Box or Zoom or whatever these third-party SaaS services are, we consider that shadow IT if it's not under the umbrella of the IT organization, right? If it's not under their control and their management and kind of their oversight. Kind of the last kind of statistic to kind of wrap this up is 99, according to Microsoft Entra's data, and this is from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report of this year, they said that Microsoft Entra data shows that password-based attacks make up over 99% of their 600 million daily identity attacks.
It's insane.
So 600 million attacks daily, identity-based attacks, right? Including phishing, social engineering, that kind of thing. 99% of them are password-based attacks. So brute forces, password sprays, credential stuffing, those are the big ones, right? And when you look at the breaches, you look at InfoStealer malware and these InfoStealer logs that have so much information. Have I Been Pwned has, bajillions of passwords in it, and there are a number of other password lists out there. More than likely, a user in your environment, if you have any kind of size to your organization or firm, statistically speaking, right, Tyler, we're gonna guess one, we're gonna find one in a breach, we're gonna spray one, or have guess one, that kind of thing. We're gonna statistically find some of those. And then the last thing is just, like I said, human behavior. It's human behavior to reuse passwords because it's easier, right? It's easier to remember one password than 100. It's simpler. And kind of the last behavioral aspect of this too, I think, Tyler, is kind of the naivete of like, oh, it won't happen to me. I'm not a target, right? I don't have anything of value. But what some people don't understand, and it's our kind of job to help them understand, right, as IT people and security people, is you could be a stepping stone to that adversary's objective, right? You might work for a third party that consults on behalf of a law firm or something, and you might be a target because you could be that gateway in to that firm or to that organization. So many times there could be stepping stones. We've seen that with InfoStealer malware as well, where there was a breach credential and InfoStealer log that led to access to a third party like Snowflake that then downstream affected other SaaS providers. So it could be downstream. There could be a supply chain aspect to this as well. So all of that to say that kind of encompasses somewhat of the password problem, right? And why we keep seeing weak passwords and why this is such an important topic to discuss on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I think with weak passwords, it's kind of one of those things that's always going to be around. There's no perfect solution that you can have in place. Just like there's no perfect solution to preventing password spraying. Some of these things are just part of it. However, that doesn't mean that you can't have the compensating controls on the back end to help when you do see initial access, which we'll talk about some of those things later. But one of the things that kind of pinged in my mind is having a security operations center that can monitor and log. Not necessarily logging password attacks and password sprays, because those are going to be happening all day, every day for the rest of time. More so logging when you get initial access on a user account. So looking for things like impossible travels is a huge thing, and having rules in place around those so you know when initial access has been gotten on an account so that you can then, react accordingly.
Yep. Yeah, and it speaks to the technical side of this conversation, right? There's kind of two parallel lines here that I see. There's the user education piece, and then there's the technical controls, right? So administrative controls, which is like your policies and in your user training and awareness. Then you have the technical controls, right? The stuff to actually safeguard or put mitigations in place to prevent certain things from happening. So I personally think that you should focus on the technical aspects first. I think you should focus on getting your tech stack where it should be and kind of bolstering those defenses before you start, doing a whole bunch of user training. I think, of course, you should train users, but I think that technical stuff is so important because, like you said, these attacks are nonstop. Users are going to get compromised, right? We're going to guess passwords. Attackers are going to guess passwords. Their password's going to get phished. Token stealing is still a thing, and session theft and all of that's going to happen. The question is, what then, right? In my mind, it's like, okay, we assume these users are going to get compromised at some point. What then? What happens after the fact? How can we defend against this threat after the user has had their password compromised? And I think one of the things is that I think of in terms of common pitfalls, right, Tyler, is the over reliance on passwords alone being the end all be all, right? Like there has to be additional things in place other than passwords. And if you're relying just on passwords, that's a kind of a dangerous game.
Yeah, I think another thing is there's not a good industry standard that says, hey, this is the golden standard for passwords and their length, complexity requirements, and all of that. I see some people reference back to NIST. I think NIST guidelines around passwords are not that great. They recommend 8-character passwords at a minimum for users. I feel like that number should be bumped up to 12, but NIST is also worried about complexity being an issue in users remembering their passwords and then them resorting back to using weak passwords as a result of having complexity requirements.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's kind of some nuance with industry standards in they don't all agree. Some are recommending 15 character password limit. Some are recommending 8, 12. There's no really good standard for people to follow. So sometimes they just fall back to this since it is a government recognized standard. And that can lead to some pretty weak, short passwords.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those frameworks and guidelines are just that. They're guidelines for organizations to fit to their needs, right? And I think a lot of that comes from misconceptions around password strength or just passwords in general, right? Most of the time, threat actors are not going to be cracking your passwords and your users' passwords, right? Maybe if there's a hash in a breach, right, or they somehow get a hash once inside the environment. But most of the time, these password attacks are spraying weak passwords, credential stuffing, which is taking passwords from a breach and trying them for users, or just raw brute force. So like you have a list, you just try every single one. Most of these password attacks are one of those three things or a combination of those three things. So password length, while important, is not the end all be all, right? I think the more important aspects are the controls you have around those passwords and the monitoring of those identities, like you said. I think it's more important to consider the frequency in which we require users to change their passwords, right? For me, in an ideal world, you wouldn't change your password at all unless it's been identified in a breach or you have some suspicious activity, known compromise, something like that. My thinking is user sets their password. It's only changed when something bad happens, or maybe once a year, just as a rotation, just as a crossing a T kind of thing, just to be sure, right? Just in case. So that's my thoughts around password length and kind of complexity. I think the other consideration, and you mentioned this, is MFA, right? MFA is undebatably necessary, right, for virtually everything, because that thing that doesn't have an MFA could be that pivot point for a threat actor, right? So while it might not seem sensitive or it might not seem important to protect that, like Zoom, right? Maybe all the recordings of all the internal team meetings are saved up in the Zoom account. Now I have access to all that, right? Or that could be a pivot point for something else. So even if it doesn't seem important, I would say put MFA on it. Whereas I used to say only the stuff that's super important, put MFA on, right? Now it's just so trivial to configure it most of the time, integrate it with SSO into your environment. I say MFA everything.
Yeah, and additionally, only certain types of MFA are going to be really good. If you're using yes/no prompts, yes, that is multi-factor, but no, that is not what I consider a secure version of MFA. Because if you don't have rate limiting on your multi-factor, I'm going to send 500 prompts to a user until they eventually just get irritated with their phone buzzing and they just press, yes, I'm trying to log in, even though they're not. So it is really, really, really important to use number matching or a system similar to that when you're using multi-factor. On the engagement I did where I cracked those user accounts, they were using number matching. And so even though I sent prompts to those users, they automatically declined them because they didn't have numbers sitting in front of them for them to enter into that prompt. And so that's an automatic key in their head that, hey, this isn't something that I did. I'm not trying to log in here. And then boom, that should be a key to a SOC or whoever that, hey, we have a failed MFA prompt. We potentially have initial access on this user account.
Yep. And that's where the detections you mentioned come in to play, is that behavioral detection of anomalies from that user, right? Maybe there isn't an impossible travel. Maybe the threat actor was smart and they did some research and they logged in from a VPN, using a VPN from the city the user would be in, right? But maybe after that, there was a whole bunch of file downloads, right, from SharePoint. Like maybe the user's going out and downloading all this stuff from SharePoint. Or maybe there's a new Outlook rule created or things like that. There are indicators that you can key off of to identify that suspicious behavior that's not strictly the login, right? And I think those are important as well, and something to consider and make sure that your MSP, your SOC, your security team is aware of, and is potentially able to kind of implement into their detection, process. So shared passwords. One thing that I commonly see, especially amongst law firms, is shared passwords, right? Especially for attorneys that have staff and kind of assistants and things like that. Many times they have a password list, and that assistant or whatever has access to that, so they can help the attorney with certain tasks, right? Whatever it might be, a court login, or it might be something that the attorney regularly has to log into to share documents or get information, do research. Those shared passwords are often kind of vulnerable as well. And because, people like convenience and ease of use, those passwords are often reused too. So again, goes back to the shadow IT talk about, how do we kind of manage those third-party sites and get those under the umbrella of IT, so that those are less likely to be compromised as well.
Yeah, I think a good solution there is password managers and being able to set strong passwords without the need to remember them. Having those auto-filled long passwords that those password managers can just inject and then save automatically, I feel like is a huge help, because then even if you do need to share your password, a lot of times those password managers will have ways to do it securely so that you can share those login with whoever needs them, and then they can get them securely and then log in via that way, instead of just, pen and paper, write down a password, give it to somebody, kind of that form.
And the reason the shadow IT stuff is really important is something that you mentioned earlier about single sign-on, right? When you talk about the third-party apps that an organization might use, like Google or Box or ShareFile, Zoom, all those third-party SaaS applications, right, that we all use every day. A lot of those have integrations for single sign-on. You can integrate them into your single sign-on tech stack, whether it's Okta, whether you use Microsoft and Entra. Usually a lot of those third-party services have those integrations. So talk to us a little bit more, Tyler, about why you think that's important and how organizations should go about kind of like looking at roping those apps into SSO.
Well, when you SSO those apps, you're automatically not making your user create and remember a new password, which I would say is the biggest benefit there. Additionally, you don't have to worry about implementing an MFA on that, as a third-party MFA such as Duo, or using, the third-party sponsored MFA, however they do it, whether it just be email or whatever. If you SSO, it's going to go back to your Microsoft environment that has, your own custom pretty page that your users know and are familiar with. Additionally, it's also going to be protected by whatever MFA you use to protect your Microsoft environment in general. So it adds, it kind of takes away the complexity of having to sign up for another site and log into another site, because you're already using credentials that you log in with every day to majority of your applications that you use. So taking away that complexity really helps users, I feel like, not be more apt to set bad passwords, because they know if I only have to remember 1, 2, or 3 passwords, then I can have more secure passwords, versus if I have 15 different cloud services and they all have different logins because they're not SSO'd, I'm more likely to use the same password across all of those, and it may be a weaker password.
Yep, exactly. And another aspect that kind of plays into this is conditional access. Obviously, there are rules that you can tie in to Entra. If you're using Entra, that's conditional access is a Microsoft thing, right? Which, I think a majority of our the environments we see are probably, safely to say Entra based, Microsoft based, although we have a large amount of Okta users, Duo users across the board, right? But when we're talking about conditional access in Microsoft, if you're using Word, Excel, Outlook, SharePoint, Excel, all those things, right? You're going to have Microsoft 365. And conditional access is great to be able to limit or kind of restrict some of that attack surface, so that that user has to log in from a trusted location, or the user can't log in from outside of the countries that you do business in, right? Of course, that can be a burden for IT in some ways. If somebody's on vacation, they got to check their email, of course, right? But there's a lot of great conditional access policies and rules that you can implement that can help limit that attack surface, be able to restrict where users can log in, where they can log in from, what they can log into, to be able to restrict that. Another good one is just requiring a sign-in from a compliant device. If you have corporate devices and they're all enrolled in Entra, you can set up a conditional access policy to require sign-ins from those compliant devices. So another great one. But conditional access, geofencing, those kinds of things, where if you have a good idea or a good sense where users are logging in or what they're logging into, you can start to begin to create some of those conditional access rules and policies around that.
Yeah, and I feel like with geofencing, there should just be some natural countries that you can inherently block out of the gate. Majority of the time, we're going to see a lot of login attempts from Russia in most environments, and 99% of the time, there is no reason for Russia to be allowed to even log in or access any of those accounts, because it's just one of those countries that majority of people don't do business with. So it's one of those that you can just block out of the gate, along with a few others, without having to worry about a lot of back end or backache from your IT on having to set exceptions for user accounts and things of that nature.
Yep, I know with our SOC, we ban a number of those, high risk countries, and I know a lot of other SOCs and MSPs do as well for that very reason. Another thing I think is kind of slept on a little bit, is a little underestimated, are banned password lists. You get this through Entra's password protection by default, although it's kind of debatable, like how updated it is and how sufficient or how well it's designed and how many passwords are in it. There are third-party products you can get to do this, like SpecOps is one, LithNet is another one for on-prem. But essentially, you can download all these password lists and you can ban them. Like, you can literally prevent the user from using that password. So when they go to change their password, it says, "Oh, sorry, you got to pick a new password," or "This password doesn't work," or "doesn't meet our password policy." And that's great, because a lot of them, like SpecOps and LithNet, you can set policies or you can specify certain patterns for the passwords. So you can specify the company name or the season year or the month year, like you were talking about. So you can specify not only a specific password, but patterns to use for those passwords that you can ban. So ban password list, banning, disabling or not disabling, restricting breached passwords, compromised passwords from being used is another really good underappreciated control that I definitely don't see being used enough.
Yeah, and I think
Go
that's
ahead.
one of the biggest recommendations I make whenever I do see these weak passwords is, hey, I do know that you're in a Microsoft environment. Here's this thing in Entra that you can go actually just paste all of these bad passwords into, even if it's just the short list that I found,
Yep.
in that interim period, that's helping you be 3 steps more secure by banning just those 3 more passwords. So that is
Yep.
something that I definitely highly recommend.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to talk about is least privilege. So I did a internal pen test last week, and I was having a conversation with a client, and it's like, the endpoint. So much of the emphasis has been on the endpoint recently in recent years, right? EDR has gotten really good. Endpoint security products have gotten really good. The monitoring of the endpoint has gotten really good. But what happens when the attacker moves off the endpoint? What happens if they're operating from an IoT device or a firewall or some other appliance on your network? What happens if they don't touch the environment at all or the endpoint at all, right? What if they just log into Microsoft 365 or some of the SaaS services? So identity is becoming more and more important, obviously. There's a lot of buzzwords around it, just like there was with zero trust. There's identity zero trust, there's identity firewalling and that kind of thing. But the core concept is least privilege, right? So if a user happens to get compromised, right? Let's say some threat actor is even able to log into their desktop, right? Maybe they log in through Citrix and now they've got an endpoint in your environment or something else, right? Or maybe they stole a laptop or whatever the case may be. Assume that user is compromised. They shouldn't be able to take down the organization. They shouldn't be able to crawl all the shares. They shouldn't be able to log in and see every document in SharePoint. They shouldn't be able to log in and see every case in the document management system, right? There should be controls. There should be walls, right? Like ethical walls built around these users and these user groups. So that's the really important thing to think about is, okay, maybe we do allow users 8-character passwords. Maybe we have MFA, but let's say we use 8-character passwords. They change them once a year. Okay, maybe they use weak passwords. What does that give them, right? And we start thinking about how can we be more resilient and build better controls after the fact, assuming the user is going to get compromised, make those users an island, think about least privilege and separating that access out, segmenting the user networks, all those kinds of things will really benefit you more than, in burning the user or burning the user on all these complex password requirements, right? Let's take some of the ownership of the controls around those accounts, build the technical controls on the back end so that even if those accounts are compromised, the damage and kind of the blast radius is very limited.
Yeah, I think something important that we didn't hit on that I wanted to talk about was honeypot accounts. Even externally, I know they're super important internally because those can be really good flags. But a lot of the times when people are going to do any type of password spraying, specifically what I do is use pass-through proxies, so you never know what IP the spray is actually coming from. So there is a plethora that you need to block. But say once you get a password, then you're going to try and log in from either your device, a VM, something, and then you have a more specific granular IP that you can block and know where that activity is actually sourcing from. So these honeypot accounts can also be useful on the external side for a more granular look into where a specific attack is coming from when you do have that plethora of IPs that a spray is coming from.
Yeah, and Canary tokens by Thinks is super amazing. They have 100 or more free Canary tokens that you can create. You can create Word documents. You can create DNS canaries. You can create an app on a fake app on your phone for canaries. All sorts of really creative and unique things. You can create canaries when someone clones a website. Think like a login page, right? If somebody clones it, you can get a canary, an alert from the canary tokens. So canaries are great. I think it's definitely one of those underutilized technologies because there's a misconception that there's a lot of work or you need stuff a lot of prerequisites or you need a lot of, whatever. But canaries, honey tokens, honey pots are really great. Something I would do if I were, in charge of security at a firm is I'd create a fake profile on LinkedIn. I'd create a SOC account for some user, right? Like some VIP type user in the firm. And I would have a real email address associated to that. And anytime somebody sends an email to that email, it would automatically, put that email on a blacklist, block the IPs, nuke it from orbit essentially, because anything emailing that account is either spam or phishing or something you don't care about anyways, right? And that's a cool technique I think is really powerful, because so much of the OSINT gathering around organizations is through LinkedIn. So putting a fake account in there and being like an early warning system can be really cool. The last piece is user education. And I saved that for last, mostly because I think it should come last. I think you have to build the house, you have to build the castle, and then you have to teach the users what to do, right? And how to respond. And I think the most important thing, Tyler, is give the users the ability to notify IT or security quickly and easily, right? If they see a suspicious email, click a button to report it. If there's a phone call, they should have some process for sending that or notifying IT or the security team of that suspicious thing. So giving users the ability to report quickly and easily is the most important thing. And then teaching them some of the red flags, right? If somebody calls asking for information that is maybe not public knowledge, like what floors Susie works on, right? Maybe that's not public knowledge. Maybe she doesn't post on social media. How would we know that, right? So when you start thinking about education, think about the things that a threat actor would maybe need or the information they would need to form an attack, and then teach users kind of the red flags of what to identify. But definitely don't overdo it with 45-minute training presentations and these long things. Like I just don't think it's that effective as we think it is. Although there's an entire industry now built around this.
Yeah, and I think educating users on weak passwords, because personally, before I got in IT, if somebody would have asked me if October 2024 exclamation point was a good password, I would have said it has an uppercase, a lowercase, a special character, and it meets link complexity requirements. So in requirements eyes, that meets 4 out of 4. That's a good password. So that can be the standpoint that some users take when they're starting to put in passwords. So educating them on why it's not, why that is a commonly used password that's easily guessable, and things of that nature, help them be more secure and set better passwords, can also help prevent some of the heartache of, initial access on those accounts.
Yep. So to kind of wrap up and put a conclusion on this, so the weak password problem, what do we do about the weak password problem as we go into 2025, right? If you're an IT leader, security leader, CIO, CISO, what should you be kind of thinking about for 2025? My thoughts are strong technical controls. Make sure that stuff is solid. Make sure the email security products you have are solid. Make sure you have good technical controls around the passwords, MFA and conditional access. Trying to implement least privilege. Make sure you're looking at that and thinking about ways you can restrict user access, assuming that those accounts will become compromised at some point. Wrangling shadow IT, that's an everlasting battle, right? Putting pieces in place or putting processes in place for users to request access to those applications first before they just go out and buy things or sign up. And then finally, educate users, right? Teach users the red flags, but importantly, give them the ability to notify IT or security quickly and easily. And that's, I think, a good roadmap, a good plan for tackling this weak password problem.
Yep. It's something you said that I really agree with is just assume your users are going to get compromised at some point and then build your technical controls around that thought.
Yep.
Because the more secure you are on the second factor of authentication, the better you're going to be.
Exactly. And I talk about this all the time on internal pen tests when it comes to like lateral movement. Assume end users are going to get, or assume an attacker is going to get local admin. Just assume it. There's so many ways to elevate privileges in a modern or an internal environment, just assume users are going to get local admin access. What next? What are we going to do about it after that, right? And it's the same kind of thing. So yeah, it's a great point. All right, so that's our episode. If you enjoyed this, please check us out on offsec.blog. If you're interested in working with us, you can check us out at securit360. That's SECURITS360.com. And leave us a message on social media or comment under one of our posts and let us know if you like this, if you like these kinds of episodes. And wishing everybody a happy Thanksgiving. And we will see you all next Wednesday.